right, so talk about hot off the presses. I had the opportunity to go through all of the group reports. So everybody that took the time to hand in their yellow sheets, I've looked at everything, I've read everything, and what I've done is I've pulled some general themes. So I'm not going to address the specific questions in any kind of detail. You realize the time is pretty short. But I've tried to capture some of the themes based on what people have been telling us. Okay, so question one, the goal was to look at a continuum of coordinated services to provide coordinated and individual plans of care, including more frequent use of electronic single plans of care. So this is pulled directly from the York YASDP Partnership Strategic Plan, and we were asking you to give us some input around how you thought we could best achieve this goal. If you read through the current strategic plan, you will see there's references to single plan of care, there's references to coordinated services, but the details of how to make that actually happen in the region need to be fleshed out a little bit. So that's what we were looking for when we asked you these questions today. And so, these are some of the things that you were talking about. The first thing that was most interesting is not everybody is familiar with the term single plan of care. There was more than one table, there was more than one person, there were several people in the room who had not heard of a single plan of care and were unfamiliar with what that meant. If this is something that we need to achieve, then clearly that's the first thing we need to do, is provide people with more information about what it actually is. Another theme that came across repeatedly was the need for parents to have access to the shared electronic record. And that's fairly controversial, I realize. There's lots of people who have lots of discussion around the pros and cons. But given the current state of technology, it seems to be inevitable that this is going to be happening, and we should be planning for that in a way that makes sense. To give people the information that they need. Yes, I do need that. I apologize, I also have a cold, so I know I'm going to cough through this. One of the other questions that came up that was quite interesting, and when we talk about the adult services question, this is going to come up again, but there is some question about where do private providers fit. Even families who are receiving significant amounts of publicly funded service often have private providers as well. And private providers have no role in the current shared electronic record and the current single plan of care. So if we're looking at truly providing a coordinated, collaborative plan of care, we need to be looking at where those private providers are going to fit in that plan, and how we're going to acknowledge that and how we're going to reference that. The role of school boards is huge. School boards are very large. Both York Region, the York Catholic Board are very large organizations, and it has been an ongoing struggle, both in the children's services area, to figure out how we can work more collaboratively with school boards. And things like, how do we have reciprocal access? Do they have access to the shared electronic record, the current shared electronic record? And if they do, are other providers going to have access to board records? What's that going to look like? It's a big question to figure out. Education is a significant part of children's lives. We need to figure out a way to make that work collaboratively. Using each other's records in ways that make sense is another topic area that came up. And then another thing that many people mentioned was the need for some compatibility in reporting formats. So one of the challenges right now is that when children go through preschool services, there's a certain format in reports, and go into education where there's a very different format in reporting, and then they move into adult services and there's different formats again. And we need to look at making more compatibility in terms of the information and the formats that we're using. You can do that. I'll cough and drink. Often identified by most groups was the fact that parents having to act as case managers is a huge barrier. But the question remains, if parents don't act as the case manager, who will? And one of the things that's critical to making a single plan of care work effectively is for someone to take that lead, whether it's formally or informally, and parents aren't always able to do that. So what happens in those situations? One of the more positive comments was that the single plan of care encourages greater input and accountability from all of the service providers. So if you know there's a single plan of care out in existence for an individual, you are more likely to make sure your reporting's up to date, that stuff gets inputted, and knowing that you're going to have to be more accountable for the service you're providing. An additional concern was the timeliness and accuracy of information. So there was lots of talk about going to the shared electronic record, but reports weren't there yet. Going to the shared electronic record, and there was duplication of reports. And I think that's an ongoing issue for any kind of electronic media. We've talked about it in a number of different ways. Excuse me. But again, that need to make sure that there's some sort of accuracy and timeliness in how the information is used. This is a really interesting comment. Again, it came up many, many times. Was one of the advantages of the shared electronic record was it reduces the need for parents to reduce the number of times they have to tell the same story over and over and over again. And that certainly is significant for almost every parent. Although it's also been my experience that even when the record exists, there are times where people insist on having the story told again. And so we also need to develop a certain amount of faith and trust in the record itself. I can remember personally, excuse me, consulting to another agency, not in York Region. And one of the most common things that the therapist, not myself, but the therapist would say to the family was, I've read your chart, but I just want to hear your story from you. And although there's a recognition that they really want to connect with the family and hear what's happening, it also does mean the family has to tell the story again. So not only do we need to have the record, but we need to have some faith in the accuracy of the record. Not everybody is using the shared electronic record, and again, I think almost everybody is aware that the use of the shared electronic record is a little bit inconsistent. And one of the barriers people identified is it doesn't really address waitlist issues. Okay. What happens after the individual turns 18? Who has access to the record? Where does the record go? What happens to the record? Who else has access to it? Those are very legitimate questions. A couple of people said that it would be helpful to have more electronic versions of release of information, consents to share information, those kinds of things. Less family stress when there's a more collaborative, coordinated service plan. Somebody else suggested that the whole notion of the shared electronic record needed to be provincial rather than just regional. One of the comments I thought was most interesting is that services may be collaborative, but they're not always coordinated. And we tend to use those two words like they mean the same thing and like they happen together all the time. So I thought it was a nice illustration that those two things don't always happen at the same time. And then the last thing was that when there's more than one child in a family who's receiving services, there needs to be a systemic way of addressing that for both service providers and for the family, rather than just simply duplicating reports in record after record. One of the overall comments is that if we could achieve this, it would be more efficient, there'd be less duplication, and much less wasted time. All right. Is there anything that anybody feels was misrepresented? Because I'm interpreting what you guys wrote and sort of pulling out themes. So is there anything that people feel didn't capture, misrepresented, was missed? It was interesting to see how consistent responses were from table to table. And it was also a little bit reassuring, given the work that Neil and I have done on the strategic plan and the conversations we've had with people, was there was nothing there that was outrageously surprising. All right, I'm going to take a moment to cough and drink, and then we'll go on to adult services. I made it through the whole winter without a cold, so.
She's got vodka in that bottle.
I wish I would be so much more fluid. Okay, so adult supports and services. The strategic plan goal is that adults with ASD, their families and agencies, and the public in York Region have the information they need to access, it should say funded, and fee-for-service providers. Themes were that we need a central information system or data bank, that for adult services, there is no one stop where you can actually see all the services and resources that are available. And there's clearly, you can access information about funded services, there are places where you can go to get some information about fee-for-service, but that's sort of cohesive, everything is in one place and I can access it. Database doesn't exist. There was talk that we need to start the conversation and the transition planning earlier than we already do. There was a discussion around the need for access to mental health services, and then again, that's not going to surprise anybody in this room. The issue around mental health services has been ongoing. The need for mentors for adults and for adolescents and young adults. So again, a very interesting comment around are there ways that we can be better equipping adolescents and young adults by people who have already lived it and gone through that experience and helping them. As Randy said this morning, it was one of the things that stuck with me the last time I heard him speak, and I still think of quite frequently, is maybe you could actually do that outrageous thing and ask the person, what has been your experience and what can you tell somebody else that would be helpful? The lack of funded services, what else in there? Again, not surprising to anybody here. Housing and employment are critical issues. The need for a service continuum. And I think that was meant, again, I'm interpreting, but I think that was meant as not only a continuum from youth services to adult services, but a continuum within the adult service stream. Again, that system for coordinating funded and fee-for-service. And one of the comments, and again, this one stuck with me as I was reading it as well, a comment that we are often having to take what is available rather than what is best. And that notion of having to settle for what we're offered rather than actually getting what we think is best for the adolescent or young adult that we're working or living with. That's the point where Neil arrived and said, let's go. So I know there were a few more comments that I missed, but that was what I was able to pull. So again, I'm going to ask you, is there anything that's been misrepresented? Anything I didn't capture? Anything that has been missed? Do you want to talk? Should I talk about things? All right, I'm done.
You're done.
I can go cough.
Again, I think we pretty much used up Janette's voice, so we'll let her go now. That was a little more challenging to do in a short period of time than we thought it was going to be, but we have captured some main themes, and any that we're missing we will add to and turn that into a guide for the next phase of the work of the York ASD Partnership. Thank you for all of that input. It's going to help us in the future.